I was already working on this video when news of a controversial new episode of beloved kids show Bluey dropped. Bluey's an Australian animated series for young children about a dog called Bluey and her family, but it's gained massive popularity with adults too, and not just parents watching along in the living room. There's something sweet and comforting about the show, which tends to model fun, engaged and nurturing parenting that lends itself to short clips online, so a lot of adults who don't have kids are also into the show too. I think it was this expectation of wholesomeness that has people feeling particularly strongly about this latest episode entitled Exercise. It begins with Bluey's dad Bandit getting on some bathroom scales, grabbing his stomach in disappointment and sighing, "Oh man." When Bluey asks what's wrong, he replies, "I just need to do some exercise." Mum Chili also walks in at that moment and adds, "Tell me about it," standing on the scales, looking at the number and sighing in disappointment too. The episode goes on to essentially give a message about exercise being something the whole family can enjoy together. Very sweet, but it's the framing of this opening scene that has some parents and commentators frustrated. Rather than keeping with the idea of exercise as something that can be fun, healthy and communal, it's framed around a dissatisfaction with the way that their bodies look and how much they weigh. This implication that the motivation behind exercise is primarily weight loss, the idea that numbers on a scale determine your self-satisfaction in some way. Comments from parents include, "Watching Bandit and Chili weigh themselves and openly hate on their bodies in front of the kids was really uncomfortable," and "Most of this episode was great. If only the first couple of minutes had reinforced the idea that exercise is for pleasure and feeling good rather than punishment for a number on a scale or what we see in the mirror." One pediatrician working with young people with eating disorders suggested that endorsing body checking, weighing and negative comments about your body in front of your children does imprint on them and can contribute over time to eating disorders. But is this all just a bit of an extreme reaction? After all, it's just one episode of a silly kids show, and kids wouldn't even pick up on that, surely. Well, unfortunately, that is not the case. A 2017 study, for example, found that 84% of the top grossing kids movies released between 2012 and 2015 promoted weight stigma, and a report from Common Sense Media in 2015 found that over half of girls and 1/3 of boys as young as ages 6 to 8 said the ideal weight was thinner than they are right now. By age 7, 1 in 4 kids had attempted some form of dieting behavior, going up to 80% of girls by age 10. Clearly, these things stick with us. On TikTok, there's even a trend of women reenacting conversations that they had with their mums growing up, where body image issues were passed along through seemingly innocuous comments that moralized food or weight, but added up. You're not gonna eat all that, are you? Nothing tastes as good as skinny feels. Shelves of Atkins diet books, watching TV shows that told you how to hide the unflattering pieces of your body. Don't take up too much space, but if you do, cover it up so other people don't have to see it. It's not just one episode of a silly kids TV show about cartoon dogs. It goes a lot deeper than that. How fat characters are portrayed. Author and lecturer Virgie Tovar describes fatphobia as a form of bigotry and discrimination that says that people of higher weight are inferior physically, intellectually, morally, and health-wise. It's also the attitudes and behaviours that cluster around that system of beliefs. When we look at the portrayal of fat characters within children's media across the years, a pattern of fatphobia emerges. A content analysis study in 2000 surveyed top children's movies and found that 72% associated thinness with positive character traits such as kindness, and 3 out of 4 equated obesity with undesirable qualities. There are several tropes and types of fat representation that run along these often negatively stereotypical lines. Where are all the fat leads? If you were to just look at the characters in many children's shows and movies, you might be forgiven for assuming that there are no fat kids at all, or at the very least, no fat children worthy of being the focus of their own stories. If we look back at the leads in the classic era of kids TV around the 2000s, what do we find? Shows like Wizards of Waverly Place, Kim Possible, Pokemon, Digimon, Hannah Montana, Totally Spies, Winx Club, Sailor Moon, Saved by the Bell, Phineas and Ferb, The Sweet Life of Zack and Cody, Lizzie McGuire, iCarly. This lack of representation itself sends a message of who is interesting and important enough to have their stories told, of what their ideal body looks like, who's supposed to be relatable for a young person. Sometimes one-off very special episodes about characters' weight happens in these shows and end up being given to slim characters, with these characters worried about gaining weight, going on fad diets, and often being reassured, don't worry, there's nothing wrong with you. Take the episode of Lizzie McGuire entitled Inner Beauty. The already skinny Miranda ends up skipping meals because she wants to look skinnier for a music video shoot. In trying to deal with this issue of body image in teen girls, the show relies on the idea that Miranda is wrong for thinking and doing this because, as Gordo and Lizzie reassure her, she isn't fat. It's all in her head. There are these implications there, right? That being Being fat might be bad, but the Miranda doesn't need to change her body because she isn't. Her concern about her appearance is a one-off episode storyline, easily concluded and cleared up by the time the credits roll. This lack of fat characters denies fat kids and teens the chance to see themselves on screen, but also creates a skewed perception of real bodies, that the scale goes from super skinny actors to slightly less super skinny actors. And attached to that idea was often a judgment that this character was the heavy one of the group and what that meant, what that character was then seen to represent, their place in the social hierarchy. Let's look at what happens when fat characters actually are present in these shows and movies. The comic relief. For these characters, their fatness is a source of humour. I think in the best versions of this trope, there is a three-dimensionality to it. There is an engagement with other facets of their personality, there is an acknowledgement of the reasons why a fat character might put themselves into the role of the Joker, especially one that utilises their weight as a self-deprecating source of laughter for others. But yeah, mostly these are side characters that are to be laughed at and not with. The supposed humour in fatness has a number of strings. Sometimes it's physical humour or slapstick comedy related to size. Think Winnie the Pooh or Augustus Gloop getting stuck in a pipe or tunnel. Other times it revolves around the idea of fatness being equated with being lazy or a slob, like Woody from The Sweet Life on Deck or Trish from Ali and AJ. All these characters are often given characteristics of poor impulse control, particularly around food. One commentator on Gravity Falls noted, "Almost every fat person in the show is depicted as a glutton and always eating food, eating things on the floor, eating rotten stuff." Or there's the links to lack of intelligence. Think Dudley Dursley from Harry Potter, for example, which leads me on to the next section: greedy, mean, and spoiled. According to an article from therapist Jessica Sprengel, who specialises in body image and eating disorders, negative characteristics are often incorrectly attributed to people in fat bodies: slovenliness, uncleanliness, low intelligence, due excessively to their size versus based in any real, true evidence. We see this within the comic relief characters, but also within other roles, like the bully Harold from Hey Arnold. Although he does eventually grow out of his bullying ways, he is consistently portrayed as stupid, bratty, and unable to control himself around food. I mean, just think about the fun little rhyme from the Oompa Loompas about Augustus Gloop. Augustus Gloop, the great big greedy nincompoop. Augustus Gloop, so big and vile, so greedy, foul, and infantile. The kids in that story are all terrors, but his weight here is directly linked to his behaviour. It is connected in the text. He is big and vile, greedy and foul. It isn't a coincidence. Probably the most quintessential example of this trope is the character of Billy Bunter, a fictional schoolboy who appeared in comics, films, and radio stories from the early 1900s in the UK. He's seen as a comic character through these associated negative traits of greed, laziness, and cowardice, always relegated to the butt of the joke in the popular stories. The appearance of this archetypal portrayal at the start of the 20th century was no accident. Professor Webb, the director of the International Centre for Research on Children's Literature, Literacy and Creativity at the University of Worcester, who researched children's novels, found over 100 years of negative stereotyping within them, concluding, "The model for the characterization of the English fat child begins back in the 19th century with the muscular Christianity movement, which emphasized masculinity. The hero is athletic and sporty. This model of heroism dominantly continues and sets up oppositional stereotypes." The stories of the time utilised fat characters not as their own heroes, but in opposition to the traits they wanted to be celebrated, of what it should mean to be manly, popular, and successful. Even fat characters who aren't actively portrayed as bad people can still fall prey to these attitudes. Take Emile from Pixar's Ratatouille, who is literally described as Remy's gluttonous older brother on the fandom pages of the movie. Lead rat Remy is obsessed with food, but he's obsessed in the right way, with good food, with quality food, whereas his brother is happy to feast on anything. He's enjoying food wrong. And then there's literally all of the humans in the movie WALL-E, which chooses to visualize polluting overconsumption, greed, and dependency on technology with the imagery of fatness. The filmmakers could have chosen any other visual motif, but decided to pair their dystopian vision with being fat. I imagine because that's what we've been told for decades is what a pitiable, greedy, dystopian version of humanity would look like. The villain. And then there's the outright villainous characters, especially when they're contrasted against the protagonists. Think Pete from the classic Mickey Mouse stories, Stromboli or the coachman from Pinocchio, Ursula from The Little Mermaid, or those relegated to secondary villainous sidekicks like Lawrence in Princess and the Frog, the LeFou in Beauty and the Beast, Mr. Snoops in The Rescuers, or Smee in Peter Pan. In the Broadway version of The Little Mermaid, we even have a new song, I Want the Good Times Back, where Ursula sings about how what she misses most about her time before she was banished was getting to eat whatever she wanted. Look at these lyrics. I want those trembling crowds of shellfish, cracked and peeled for me to dine. Not because I'm mean or selfish, I only want what's mine. I want disgusting wealth, I want exquisite sin. Want the entire sea to worship me on bended fin. I want to greet my loving subjects and then have them as a snack. Remember those good times, I want them back. Toy Story does this like 3 times with Stinky Pete, Lotso and Al of Al's Toy Barn fame, even doing a kind of double trope with Pete by making him also be the comic relief of the Woody's Roundup gang before his villain reveal begins. And there's also a particular brand of fat villain in the villainous elite, the king, queen or otherwise leader, in a visual stand-in for excess of wealth. The Queen of Hearts in Disney's Alice in Wonderland or Ratcliffe in Pocahontas are obvious examples, but also Mayor Shelburne in Cloudy with a Chance of Meatballs, the Don in Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, the Great Goblin and the Master of Lake Town in the Hobbit movies, and potentially the most obvious example, Jabba the Hutt from Star Wars. Obviously, children's stories also include villains who aren't fat, but I think it's the lack of fat protagonists and fat heroes that makes this trend particularly damning. A marker of undesirability. To be fat in many pieces of media is to be undesirable. Being fat is therefore something to be fixed. There are multiple jokes about Peter B. Parker in Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse, for example, in his very minor weight gain. In one episode of The Proud Family, Grandma Sugar Mama decides that she has to lose weight for her wedding and goes on a Rocky-esque montage. In the Trolls movie, King Gristle Jr. asks the girl out and then immediately goes home and hops on the treadmill because he wants to lose 30 pounds in the next 8 hours. These are all joked about with the attitude that we, as an audience, know that this is the obvious response to being fat, that you have to change to win love, to deserve it even. We also have the villain whose fatness and associated undesirability is itself meant to be humorous, like the matchmaker from Mulan and I guess the brothel owner from Aladdin, who are contrasted with the thin and beautiful women around them. There is this interesting article about girl sidekicks in Disney Channel cartoons I found by writer Olivia Lucchini, how they fulfill this kind of sweet, cute, thin girlhood ideal. Most of them are slender and long, not taking up much space. If a character is allowed to be bigger, it is always a male character and he is always comedic relief if he's dumb or evil if he's not. And when female characters are fat, children's shows go out of their way to indicate their undesirability. In the episode of The Proud Family where Sugar Mama loses weight, Pappy, her crush, doesn't recognise her and shows romantic interest in her for the first time. Then, after eating one bite of cake, her body comically reverts back to her original larger form and she embraces Puppy, who is now horrified. We also see this in Gravity Falls with the character of Grenda. Grenda's defining characteristics, according to her wiki page, are her large physique, obsession with boys, physical strength, and a deep, gruff and masculine voice. Grenda is voiced by a male actor. We see her snag the attentions of a rich and attractive Austrian Baron Marius in one episode, but the fact that Grenda is the one he likes is played as the unexpected comic ending in the show. The apparent joke within these storylines is that characters like Sugar Mama and Grenda are expressing romantic desire despite being almost always seen as undesirable to the male characters around them. This plays into larger, more toxic tropes, portraying any character with a libido outside of a narrow body ideal as repulsive or predatory. A lot of the time, morally good fat characters in kids' media are adults who are almost permitted in a horrible way to be fat. They are older women like Widow Tweed in The Fox and the Hound or Mama Odie in Princess and the Frog, who are allowed to be comforting and soft to fulfill another function of womanhood beyond supposed attractiveness, the comforting and wise grandma character. They are not, however, meaningful representation for fat children and teens. So I guess at the end of this section about desire, it's as good a time as any to thank returning sponsor Dipsy for supporting the channel and letting this notoriously asexual lesbian tell you about their short and sexy audio stories designed by women for women. While I kick back and read this piece about choosing body neutrality over body positivity on their blog, you can go listen to something a bit steamier, a second chance romance, an adventurous vacation fling, maybe a hot and heavy hookup. The immersive soundscapes, talented voice actors, 56% of whom are people of colour, and specially written stories mean Dipsy has something for everyone. everyone, of any gender or sexuality. Plus, there's new content released each week, so there's always something new to try. I might listen to this train journey sleep track, lulling me into slumber with the sound of a carriage passing through the lush countryside. You might wish to be tucked into bed by this sweet author Jennifer, who continues to write beside you in her library. They also have wellness sessions, ASMR soundscapes, and written pieces to enjoy alongside the classic audio stories. Check Dipsy out now to find your go-to place to explore your fantasies, relax and unwind, or heat things up with a partner. Dipsy's offering my audience an extended 30-day free trial when you go to dipsystories.com/Rowan-Ellis. That's 30 days of full access for free when you go to DIPSEA stories.com/Rowan-Ellis. How skinny characters talk about fatness. Skinny characters on children's shows are frequently fatphobic in the literal sense that they are irrationally afraid of fatness in a way that many people are afraid of, say, spiders. In Good Luck Charlie, PJ has a nightmare about gaining weight where the house literally shakes as he walks down the stairs. There's a similar scene in Arthur where Arthur's worried that he's getting fat and has a nightmare where his body keeps getting bigger and bigger. In this nightmare, he becomes so big that a circus performer invites strangers to go at this large, lardy, lifeless layabout lump of lumpiness. In The Sweet Life of Zack and Cody, after someone tells London that her butt is too big, she sees a distorted image of herself in the mirror that prompts her to stop eating and obsessively work out. And in the That's So Raven episode Food for Thought, after a fast food court opens in the school cafeteria, Raven has a nightmare vision where everyone at the school, including her, is now fat. And then in Sabrina the Teenage Witch, Sabrina sees a reflection of herself in a bewitched mirror that makes her look much larger than she actually is, which prompts her to start drinking magical weight loss smoothies. These storylines often come from very special episodes that I mentioned earlier, where a skinny character goes on an extreme diet or develops disordered eating and then fully recovers by the end of the episode. At their best, these episodes can be a warning for children about crash dieting, but at their worst, they just promote fatphobic attitudes. These episodes never actually address the character's fear of gaining weight. Nobody says, hey, gaining weight is actually a natural part of puberty, or being fat and being healthy aren't mutually exclusive, or even just, it's okay to be fat. Like, it's okay to exist in the body that you have. And those very special episodes are the kinder depictions of disordered eating in children's media. Female villains who are already skinny often seem to be given eating disorders as a way to signify their vanity. For example, in season 1 of Disney Channel's Shake It Up, a snooty partygoer says to protagonists, "You're adorable. I could just eat you guys up. You know, if I ate." In the Disney Channel movie Princess Protection Program, one character says, "I'd rather eat carbs than see her wear my crown." And in a Cinderella story, a mean girl asks Sam what she can order that has no sugar, no carbs, and is fat-free. These characters are then held in contrast to a more not like other girls-esque protagonist, who is herself also slim, but by some happy accident of fate. Other children's media chooses to demonize so-called unhealthy eating. Zoe 1 is particularly rife with this, with one damning scene showing a group of girls worrying about eating a single slice of chocolate cake because it has too many calories. In addition to internalizing fat phobia, skinny characters also often fat shame or food shame characters around them. Again, in Zoe 101, a skinny character reacts in disgust to her teacher eating a salad with Thousand Island dressing. So the ideal tween protagonist doesn't eat unhealthy foods, but also isn't vain enough to care about carbs, but still needs to be skinny regardless. Children's TV isn't just for entertainment. It's meant to be a form of social education in many cases. That's why there are so many episodes about the importance of sharing and kindness and being true to yourself. So what does it say about us as a society that we insist on teaching our children that fatness is something to be feared and mocked, that naturally being skinny is tied to moral goodness, whereas being fat or desiring to lose weight is not? It goes further than that. Fatphobia is not an isolated phenomenon. It is intimately linked and intersects with other factors, including marginalized identities and experiences, economics, and political discourse. Even the body positivity movement, rooted in the fat rights movement of last century, finds itself affected by this, becoming folded into the churn of capitalism, used as a buzzword by businesses wanting a pat on the back for including one plus-size model in a campaign each year. The body positive hashtag online is full of people who aren't fat, applauding themselves for loving their bodies even though they feel inside like they're fat, how brave they are for showing their straight-sized bodies. And according to one piece of research conducted in 2022, these posts show a remarkable absence of BIPOC, Two-Spirit, LGBTQIA+, older, gender non-conforming, and or disabled representations. This same piece of research noted the myriad ways that body positivity has been commodified and packaged into a product or service for consumption, with the hashtag frequently used against paid brand deals and ads, even for diet-based products. A diet industry which, by the way, is worth a hell of a lot of money. It turns out it pays to have people dissatisfied with the way that they look. Even a movement originating in fat liberation has become sanitized to prioritize generic, non-political messages of individual self-acceptance. It's ironically created an acceptable appearance of body positivity, which outcasts the very people it was originally meant to empower, with fatphobic commentators responding, "I'm all for body positivity, but these people have taken it too far." These people being fat people. Dismantling fatphobia is about dismantling patriarchal structures of beauty and worth. It's about scrutinizing medical bias. It's about challenging white supremacist standards of existence. In the book Fearing the Black Body by Sabrina Strings, she talks about the shifts in social attitudes towards fatness, from being a sign of wealth and prosperity to a 17th century concept of poor moral character and mental incapacity, to the connections with the nationalism and eugenics in the 18th century and beyond. Far from being some scientific or medical development that led to modern fatphobia, she points to how fatphobia, as it relates to black women, did not originate with medical findings, but with the Enlightenment era belief that fatness was evidence of savagery and racial inferiority. In her book Fat Shame, Stigma and the Fat Body in American Culture, author Amy Erdman Farrell writes, "Fatness was a motif used to study inferior bodies, those of immigrants, former slaves and women, and it became a telltale sign of a superior person falling from grace. Essentially the idea that the thin white body was the ideal, that it represented any number of projected moral goods, whether a Protestant work ethic, self-control, good health, without there necessarily being a causal link between the two things. We see time and time again the physical body being used to define and separate the other." Barbara Christian, an American black feminist critic, claims that the enslaved African woman became the basis for the definition of our society's other. Consider the dehumanizing display of Sarah Baartman in the early 1800s, an enslaved woman kept as an attraction and a so-called freak show because of her size and body shape. This conceptualizing of the other as fundamentally physically different, even as a curiosity, has long been a basis upon which to justify objectification and subjugation. We can see how current instances of racism are compounded by fatphobia, with medical discrimination being a particular concern for people of colour, especially black women and fat people. For fat black women, those experiences are likely to be worse. Research from 2016 also found there seems to be a correlation between being larger bodied and being targeted by police, especially for black and Hispanic men and boys, with a separate piece of research from the following year noting that people tend to perceive black men as larger and hence more threatening than white men of the same weight and height. And so we can see how the combination of race and fatphobia can quite literally be dangerous, even deadly. This then feeds into ideas of fatness and classism, where once being fat was a marker of high class status, this is now reversed. A psychologist, Dr. Annie Zimmerman, describes, "Those with the economic resources required to maintain the wellness lifestyle pursue it not only for the perceived benefits to the individual, but for the fillip to their online and real-world status. On the opposite side of the spectrum, fast food and obesity have come to be associated with those on a lower income. Classist stereotypes combine with fatphobic ones to compound an image of both fat and working-class people as lazy, unintelligent, and to blame for their own circumstances, particularly when the circumstances are seen as negative." In an interview from last year, queer fat historian Carly Pendleton talked about the ways in which fatphobia also affects queer people in specific ways. "I don't think fat itself impedes gender expression, but rather there is a lack of access to clothing and material goods which allow fat people to play with and express their gender. There are also significant medical barriers for fat trans people seeking gender-affirming care, such as BMI limits for surgery." They then went on to discuss the relationship she saw between queerness and fat liberation, and the ways they can feed into one another in a political and freeing way. "Speaking from my own personal fat queer perspective, queerness has offered me not only an academic way of viewing myself, my identities, and my environment, but a path to creating a more livable world for everyone. To queer, as a verb, means to disrupt, to defy the binary. It shows you that it's not about fat, thin, healthy, unhealthy, cis, trans, but about the mechanics of oppression that trap us into binary structures in the first place. I myself have spoken to trans friends who found it difficult to find images of fat bodies post-top surgery, or who struggled to access safe binders for their size. I've seen the ways that toxic body pressures within gay male subcultures have pushed friends into harmful relationships with their bodies and food and exercise, making those that feel unworthy of love because of homophobia even more convinced of that supposed internal truth because of fatphobia too. The impact. When we talk about representation within children's shows and in kids' movies, there's an element of the morally didactic around excusing fatphobic storylines, right? Fat shaming is teaching an important lesson. It's encouraging healthy lifestyles. It's an ethical imperative to start young people off on the right path in the world. But that simply isn't true. There is a difference between highlighting healthy physical and mental practices for children and relying on body shaming and fatphobia to do it, because the impact of fatphobia on children is potentially terrifying. A 2017 study found that viewing yourself as overweight was associated with unhealthy blood pressure, cholesterol, and glucose levels, even in those who had so-called normal BMIs. Just the perception of being fat was enough, with a number of other studies pointing to the joined pressures of fatphobia, raising of cortisol levels, and other physiological stress responses, which are tied to negative health outcomes. Another 2016 analysis of data collected from over 21,000 Americans found a significant association between a person's experiences of weight stigma and an increased incidence of heart disease, stomach ulcers, diabetes, and high cholesterol. Again, this is after controlling for other factors like socioeconomic status, physical activity level, and their actual weight. These aspects of health in fat patients are complicated by the weight stigma within the medical industry itself, with evidence of patients with higher BMIs receiving not just fat-shaming attitudes, but also actively substandard care, including potential misdiagnoses and inadequate treatment. And it goes beyond physical health. Young people's mental health is also at risk from these attitudes. Research released in 2016 by the Professional Association for Childcare and Early Years found that 47% of childcare professionals had seen anxiety about body image in kids between 6 and 10 years old. Author Ashley Nessler has written about the experience of fat shaming within school through public tests and comments by staff. This practice did nothing to teach me habits that are beneficial for respecting my body and appreciating everything my body can do. Instead, it put focus on my biggest failing, that I was fat, and emphasized that something was inherently wrong with my body and that I should be ashamed of it. The danger of obesity was translated to me so many ways growing up, and these practices also taught my peers that something was deeply wrong with me and that I was somehow lesser due to my size. Fatphobia is not providing a morally neutral and objective lesson on health for kids. It's shaming them and instilling guilt, encouraging a focus on appearance over actual markers of health. She continued, "This obsession took the focus away from my hobbies and the passions that made me feel alive and helped me to enjoy life. This obsession consumed my true self and turned me into someone who was praised by others simply because I was losing weight quickly, and my eating habits translated to me being a good person. Instead of learning healthy habits that benefit my body and mind, I developed habits such as restriction, and to this day I still struggle with eating." This connection between eating, weight, food, and being a good person is not just a connection being made by 1 or 2 children. A 2013 study by Leeds University found that children started demonstrating prejudice against fat people at just 4 years old. They were asked to compare different versions of a fictional character called Alfie, and the kids concluded that the fat version of Alfie would be less likely than the others to do well in school, be happy with his appearance, or have a lot of friends based entirely on how he looked. A 2017 study found that kids who were deemed overweight were less liked by their peers and more likely to be bullied and excluded, starting as early as the first grade, with evidence from another longitudinal national study of adolescent health suggesting that adolescents deemed overweight are significantly more likely to experience social isolation and are less likely to be nominated as friends by peers. Poor representations of fat characters and fatphobia are not just harmless pieces of fiction on kids' TV, they are influential whether we want them to be or not. In the 1990s, researchers from Harvard studied how the introduction of TV affected the body image attitudes of teen girls in Fiji. At the point where access to Western satellite TV shows like Beverly Hills 90210 started in 1995, they surveyed a group of girls and found their traditional local attitude of round and fat fat bodies being attractive was common, rates of eating disorders were fairly low, at just 3% of the girls saying that they had ever vomited to control their weight. But just 3 years later, in 1998, they returned and found that at that point, 15% of the girls they surveyed had vomited in order to control their weight. They had specifically found a correlation between the amount of TV the girls watched and the likelihood that they had negative feelings about their bodies. Girls who said in 1998 that they watched TV 3 or more nights a week, 50% more likely to describe themselves as too big or fat, even though the girls' average weight hadn't changed. There's no escape. This isn't just a problem in kids' media. There's arguably little difference in representation once you graduate to teen and adult shows and movies too. Think about the comedy genre. It's full of similar stereotypes and uses of fat as a shorthand for lazy, unintelligent, or unattractive characters. From 90s comedy movies packed with fat suit humour to Scully and Hitchcock in beloved sitcom Brooklyn Nine-Nine consistently used as the butt of the joke as incompetent cops. Perhaps the most iconic of all, we have Fat Monica from Friends. In flashbacks, we see Courtney Cox in a fat suit constantly eating while those around her make jokes at her expense. And of course, the reveal that Monica decided to lose weight after overhearing Chandler tell Ross, "I just don't want to be stuck here all night with your fat sister." Ouch. Even when a show itself doesn't demonize a character for their weight, audiences seem to love to. Modern Family star Ariel Winter has spoken about people commenting on the show and her changing body as she went through puberty, saying she told herself, "They hate this about me. I need to work on it. I need to be thinner. I need to change my hair here. My cheeks look weird. If I change these things about me, the things they hate about me, I'm not going to get that anymore. I'm going to get praised." This idea that actresses in particular are too fat to play roles is a long history. Remember Jennifer Lawrence being cast as Katniss in The Hunger Games? Or more recently, Danielle Rose Russell being bullied off Twitter after it was rumoured that she would be playing the lead in an ACOTAR adaptation. The trend that we noted of showing fat phobia on screen, but specifically towards those who are themselves thin, also continues in adult media. Half of the plot of Bridget Jones is about her needing to lose weight, and yet she tells us she's only 9.5 stone and is played by Renee Zellweger, who was smaller than even that when she took on the role. And there's infamous examples of specific scenes too, demands that cheerleaders go on diets in Bring It On, and disgusted panic at Samantha's supposed weight gain in Sex and the City. The most insidious of all might be utilising fatphobic stereotypes to encourage laughter at a fat character for daring to assume that they could be respected, desired, or loved. The idea that the only thing funnier than a fat person is one deluded enough to think that they aren't fat, or that their fatness doesn't matter. There isn't much reprieve in dramatic roles either, with actresses told to lose weight across all genres, regardless of whether it has anything to do with the role itself, leading to a noticeable lack of fat heroines and leads. When fat characters are in the spotlight, their weight is often used as a painful source of tragedy, from the abused teen Precious to the depressed teacher Charlie in The Whale. If you'd like to hear more of my thoughts on that particular movie, we did an episode of the Queer Movie Podcast about The Whale, which I will link below. But I think it's telling that when you look at the top films about fat characters on Ranker.com, The Santa Claus is the third top pick. Even in the supposedly neutral world of reporting the news, the biases still seep in. How often do you see reports that feature what writers Laura Waite and Erin Pritchard described as humiliating images of fat bodies with large expanses of stomach or backside in ill-fitting casual clothes? The images are rarely of people dressed like professionals. They do not signify productivity and achievement. Instead, fat bodies are represented as inferior, deficient, and ugly. This is clearly not a bias we grow out of after being given these messages as children. It stays with us, continues to have an effect. Adult attitudes and real consequences. If we look back at the impact that fat phobia can have on kids, we can see its progression into adults. In the medical field, we see surveys where 24% of physicians admitted that they were uncomfortable with having friends in larger bodies, and 18% said they said disgusted when treating a patient with a higher BMI. Even with mounds of research to show its inefficiency as a one-size-fits-all diagnostic tool, BMI is still being used in many areas of medical care, with unfitness being equated with fatness, regardless of research that contradicts these simplistic binary viewpoints. In everyday life, an acute awareness of these biases across much of the population can have an effect on fat people's freedoms of expression and movement, what they're told they are supposed to, even allowed to wear, which is then enforced by lack of inclusive clothing sizes and design changes made to plus-size ranges. In her memoir, Happy Fat, comedian Sophie Hagen talks about the anxiety they felt accessing their local gym and and swimming pool, staying in the changing room for almost an hour saying, gyms are for thin people. Staying home and eating chips is for fat people. So for a fat person, going to a gym or running in the park or doing exercise in a place with people can be anxiety inducing because you are so on display doing something that is considered uncharacteristic. Being fat can even affect your career. A few years ago, there was a very public example of a professor who tweeted, "Dear obese PhD applicants, if you didn't have the willpower to stop eating carbs, you won't have the willpower to do a dissertation. #truth." But multiple studies seem to suggest assumptions about candidates and colleagues based on their weight are not one-off instances. In 2008, a study found that overweight job applicants are viewed as being on average less conscientious, less agreeable, less emotionally stable, and less extroverted than their normal weight counterparts. Another piece of research in 2012 of HR professionals showed they were more likely to disqualify obese people from being hired and less likely to nominate them for supervisory positions. What is good fat representation? When you look at the characters mentioned, most often on Reddit threads and Tumblr posts about good fat representation for kids, a small number of the same reasonably recent examples come up a lot, like Barney from Dead End Paranormal Park, Glimmer from She-Ra before that character design change, and Steven from Steven Universe. But where do we go from here? Some people might be for representation that acknowledges fat phobia and tackles it head on. After all, these are very real effects that fat children will already be experiencing, and we see these effects stay with fat people into adulthood. Should we not represent that reality? Or might we risk replicating it by putting forward the idea that it is something that could be used to bully or shame other children? We see an example of this type of representation in the case of Disney's first plus-size female protagonist in a short film from last year, Reflect. A ballerina Bianca is dancing in a room full of mirrors, clearly self-conscious, with her confidence utterly shattering when she sees her own reflection. She battles her way mentally through these negative thoughts and ends with this kind of triumphant ending. There is this tricky balance of feeling the need to show the biased attitudes in order to then give the cathartic character change to overcome them. Would a storyline with the fat lead that didn't have anything to do with their weight have been as easy to pitch as a concept as this was? The alternative, where representation exists in a fictional reality with no fat phobia, would present a more utopian ideal for kids. But can we keep fat phobic attitudes away from children, or would this just give them a sugar-coated version of the world they have to exist in? And would that matter? Seeing confident, happy, complex fat characters, is it enough to offset these issues? Would it make fat children currently suffering from fatphobic attitudes from adults and other children alike feel less alone to have it acknowledged? These questions feel very similar to those we ask about presenting things like homophobia or sexism or ableism in media, and as with them, it seems that the key is more representation from authentic voices and more variety and balance within that representation rather than a one-size-fits-all attitude. Literary critic Rebecca Rabinowitz wrote about her hope for the future of fat representation in children's books, and I think it sums up this idea perfectly. I want to see characters whose fatness is not symbolic of anything. Characters who are fat simply because some people in the real world are fat. I want characters who complete their emotional and social and physical growth arcs without becoming less fat. I want characters that confront fat phobia head on, and I'd also like to see books that aren't especially about fatness but feature fat characters. Allow fat characters a humanity that non-fat characters have. Banish fatness as a symbol. Banish the textual message that a fat character is okay only as long as they're on their way to becoming less fat. One teen TV show which comes up again and again in the discussion of iconic fat representation, which has spawned multiple retrospective articles and gushing praise, is My Mad Fat Diary, which follows a teenage girl as she deals with school, life, and love while struggling with her mental health. Here are just a couple of quotes from viewers about the show and what it meant to them. "For those of us who have ever been fat, lonely, and mentally unwell, it was the first time we were seeing ourselves properly portrayed on TV. The show sets a new standard for complex characters, representing fat girlhood in all its glory, hardship, and chaos. For audiences, it was one of the first portrayals of fatness that was unafraid to be real. Fatness gets its main character moment, as Ray isn't just an easy joke or optimistic best friend. She endures the battle for self-love beyond just her body, experiencing the whole spectrum of teenage chaos." But it wasn't just that it was the only show available that touched on these experiences. Even now, new audiences come to the show and have the same reaction. The British TV series was based on a collection of real diary entries written by Ray Earl, who was a teen in the mid-90s. 90s in Stanford. The lead Ray was played by actress Sharon Rooney, and I think that those two elements are integral to its beloved status. It feels like something the future of representation can learn from. There was no very special one-off episode, no skinny actress in a fat suit, no capitalist message of self-acceptance through consumption, just a grounding in authenticity and one girl's truth, however messy that might have been. Thank you so much for watching. I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments, and if you would like to help support this channel, then I will also leave a link to my Patreon in the description, along with all my social media links. You can find me all over the internet. And until I see you next time, bye.